what I was learning from him was about how to be, and how this opposition to our challenges, to our suffering, to our pain, to our symptoms, that maybe they can be a bridge to something deeper.
Well, hello, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to the podcast, Anecdotal Evidence. This is your host, Daniel Johnson, MD. Thanks for bearing with us here. I've been on break for a couple weeks, reorganizing and restructuring the podcast. I'm looking forward to sharing this with you and telling you more about that in the future. We're here on episode 10, and episode 9 was a recap of the previous episodes. And I guess we're at a milestone now that we're here at episode 10, and I'm very excited about sharing my conversation with Dr. Saraswati Markus with you. It's been a nice little break for me here. Got to spend some time down at the beach right after Hurricane Joaquin hit. It was a pretty brutal hurricane, particularly for South Carolina. It was wet where I was at near Wilmington, but I've been thinking and praying for all the folks affected by this hurricane. It's an exciting time for the podcast, as I've now got some official help in the production of the podcast. My friend Brian Mashburn, an Asheville artist whose work is definitely worth checking out at brianmashburnart.com. He's been doing the episode covers for each episode of the podcast, and he's now going to be helping me with the editing as well. He's been the creative consultant from the get-go. For the past years, we've been working on this. So very excited to have him on board. He's got some great insight, and he's got a lot of experience listening to podcasts, so his feedback's been very useful. So check us out on the web at danieljohnsonmd.com/podcast. That's our home on the web. We also have a YouTube channel, Anecdotal Evidence with Daniel Johnson, MD. And feel free to send us some feedback via email. The email address is anecdotalevidence@danieljohnsonmd.com. We'd love to hear from you, including if you're interested in being a guest on the podcast. But back to the issue at hand, the episode at hand, my conversation with Dr. Saraswati. We met last July, over 3 months ago now, in her office. And it was a pretty auspicious day to be meeting with her, because later that night she was on schedule to be recognized by the Asheville Yoga Festival for her contributions to teaching yoga to Western North Carolina. So it was nice to get to meet her on such a special day. And she had my partner Brooke and myself over to her yoga studio and practice space. It's a beautiful space that she has converted from an old carburetor repair shop into just a beautiful yoga studio and Chinese medicine space. And it was great to get a chance to meet her. She was very warm and welcoming, and we had some nice tea and had an opportunity to have a nice conversation. I was particularly interested in her background in both Chinese medicine and yoga, and how she has been able to blend and integrate these two different disciplines, which are both holistic fields, but come from different backgrounds. She shares with us how she was able to integrate these disciplines into treating the one being that is within us. And it's also important for me to recognize that Dr. Saraswati is the first woman guest on the podcast, which is a great honor because her specialty is women's health. So as I mentioned in episode 9, there's going to be a number of women who I'm excited to share my conversations with coming up, which will help to bring the body of work into a greater sense of balance. So I really appreciated my chance to get to meet her and get to speak with her, and I hope you enjoy my conversation with Dr. Saraswati. start by just commenting on it's so comfortable being in this space. There's so much attention that's gone into this building. This is pretty awesome. So you were telling me this is an old carburetor repair shop we're in right now?
That's one of its incarnations. Yes.
Okay.
It's been many things, and when I started to pull the building apart, we found out it has actually been on fire as well.
Yeah.
We found all kinds of things, when you actually remodel something. So yeah, but you really can't tell it was people who walk in here who knew what it was are just, floored, by the transformation.
Yeah, I feel like I've walked into the Far East. And I've never been to the Far East. I've been to Southeast Asia, and that looks a little familiar. Like, is that a Southeast Asian?
I think that is
sculpture?
from Thailand.
Yeah.
I think it's a Thai piece, and that's actually Saraswati.
Oh, okay.
The goddess.
Yeah.
And so people tend to give me images of Saraswati, and that was a gift.
Oh.
Beautiful one.
Yes, it is. Wow. So that's your name. That's what you go by.
I do.
Okay.
I do. And kind of, stepped more and more and more into it since I was given the name. I was given the name in India, in the Himalayas, at an ashram where I was with a great teacher, woman. And, within the first 5 minutes of being with her, she gave me that name. And I wept. I didn't know who Saraswati was at all. It wasn't I didn't know a lot about the deities particularly, although I had been practicing yoga for a long time. But, you know, as a yogi, that there's all kinds of aspects of yoga, and learning about the gods and the goddesses or the mythology isn't necessarily the first thing you learn. So I was sort of at that place. I knew some of them, but...
yeah. So Saraswati is a goddess herself.
She is. She's the goddess of, most commonly thought of as the goddess of music. Sometimes she's thought of as the goddess of wisdom. And the way I actually just wrote a blog piece on this, really how I've felt her energy emerge or kind of understand her more and more. But the way she brings forth wisdom or music or language or knowledge, it's more in the form of inspiration. So she's someone we can all call to become inspired, to bring forth or to birth into being, what is your essence? What are your gifts? What you are meant to bring forth into the world. So really she is, in a certain way, a fertility goddess, which is very interesting because it's been, on the most kind of the grosser level, the more physical level has been a big part of my history and continues to be a big part of my work, helping couples to conceive and working with women throughout the whole life cycle. But that fertility piece is really where I began my whole, professional life as a holistic gynecologist. And it's so interesting that, 17 years later or something, I was given this name, and this is how I understand her to really function as bringing life through. However that life should manifest, it's still life.
Right.
So.
Right. So you were given the name 17 years in, as you said. So we'll pick it back up there at some point, but you weren't born in India, I guess.
No, I was born in this area. About 6 hours north in Virginia.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And then when I was 24, I moved out to California. And just so happened my downstairs neighbor was an acupuncturist. His name is Mark. And we're still in very close touch. But he pretty much blew my mind. I was just your just average suburban girl. I was, I guess, 23 years old. And, Mark would come upstairs. I moved in with my mom, and Mark would come upstairs and, play guitar. And, I remember he cooked brown rice and tofu. And I was like, what is this food, in a wok? And,
Uh-huh.
I had never, ever seen anything like that. And then he was doing acupuncture for my mom's knees, and they were getting better. And I just was like hung on every word, and it's just every single word he said, was true. It didn't need to go through some sort of filter, but I just sort of, when he talked about energy and everything is one and like that, I was like, yes, there, it was just like, yes. So, and then he really helped me a lot. I went through a little kind of rough patch, which is, like lots of 23-year-olds do.
Yeah.
And he was so compassionate and helpful in terms of inviting me to his clinic and visiting me, and just that kind of real, he's truly dedicated to his patients. And I was the recipient of that. And it was like kind of overwhelming to have that kind of care.
Yeah, well, that sounds like a formative experience, certainly something that really got things going for you, perhaps, in your 20s, moving to California and learning of this tradition that, just all of these things that you're describing are probably a little harder to find in Virginia, perhaps. Yeah.
It was brand new to me, and every single thing,
Mm-hmm. So what was it like? Did you grow up in Virginia?
I did.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
did,
What part are we talking about?
Richmond.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sure that shaped you in some ways. You're back in the South now, not in California. What was it like for you growing up in Richmond?
My life has gotten just exponentially better as I've gotten older, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah.
I'm a little bit like stick out like a sore thumb in my family.
Uh-huh.
I'm not like the rest of my family.
You're the only Saraswati.
I'm the only Saraswati.
Do you have brothers and sisters?
I do. I have 2 older brothers and 1 younger sister. And my oldest brother passed away, but I still kind of count him in the group.
Oh, yeah.
So those 2 live out in California with my mom, and my sister lives in Wilmington. So I had very mainstream parents, they have their own karma. So I don't really mean to come out as sort of like judging what they should or shouldn't have done. But, if I were their age, I really wish I would have been, a really, hardcore hippie. They could have gone that way. They were, that age, they could have been in San Francisco, they could have been anywhere, but they were kind of a little bit more mainstream, more straight.
I judged my parents for the longest time for not fully participating in the 60s.
Yeah, they just were the other people in the 60s.
But right, everybody's got their own path.
Yeah, they did.
Yeah.
They did. So
were they together as you were growing up? Or?
They separated when I was about 12.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's tough.
It was. I didn't see my father for quite a while, and that that continues to be its own journey, and how that sort of informs the way just the way I spoke to him on Father's Day. And I was talking to him and saying, I almost didn't call because, I don't really call you very much. And I felt like it's Father's Day, so I'm obligated to call. And that made me feel like I wanted to call less, because I'd prefer to call you because I wanted to call you, not because I was obligated to call you. And he's like, maybe you don't need to think about it that much.
It's hard to find the right word. Yeah.
And I'm like, well, I don't know. I think, that's just where we're different. I like actually really purposefully, mindfully doing things. And that's a value I have. And so I had to make that decision around Father's Day. But it seemed like a nice thing to do.
Uh-huh.
a kind thing to do. So I decided to do it.
Yeah. So you said you were different in your family from an early age. Did you have that mindfulness? Was being third of 4 kids, was that part of it, to kind of, you found your own little niche, how to observe, or what was it like for you?
That didn't come till later, this sort of really recognition of being different than the rest. Like I completely chose a different path than anybody in my family, for the most part. My sister and I are a little bit more similar, but I had a very predictable childhood. Nothing really stood out. My mother really, really loved me. Like, she was my biggest fan. I mean, I would think that for a long part of my life that I was probably her favorite. And maybe that was only because she had 2 boys and then she had a girl, and she was just like, just delighted, to have a girl.
Are y'all still close?
We are. I mean, she's passed away. She dropped her body as well. A lot of people have died in the last year and a half. So it's been a very heavy year in that regard.
Yeah. I lost my dad last year too, so I'm with you. It's tough times. It's the heaviness with the grief.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's also the stage of life that's at least where I'm 50, and this
41.
is where a lot of things start stacking up, and that's, I think, actually a big issue with regard to health and healing, is the recognition that this life stage is a time where there's a lot of layering and stacking, that if we're not very careful, we can get pulled under by all of that.
Yeah. A friend of mine mentioned the wounded healer archetype, Daniel Nevins, and when we were talking, and that I feel that from time to time, doing healing work and yet still working through the grief as it's stacking up, how to still stay present or how to take time away. It's a challenge for me.
I was talking to my coworker yesterday about how, I can be in some place that's less than optimistic or less than positive, but as soon as I come into the clinic or work with patients or start teaching students yoga, the seva or the service takes over, and I'm always wondering if it's going to keep working, like somehow it's going to stop, but that full well that we have to draw from and give from, it continues to show up.
When did that start for you? And when did you know that that was your path to be a healer? When did you find that?
When I met Mark.
Okay, yeah, like you were talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know right away, but I knew. I was like, wow.
Yeah.
And within a year, I had enrolled in acupuncture school. I guess I was about 24 when I started acupuncture school. So it really was my first career. And for a lot of people, it was more they're coming back to school to study something kind of far out that there wasn't any infrastructure in the world to go out and get a job for, or there's hardly still is any.
Yeah,
right. So you got to sort of make it on your own out there. But back then, for sure. So that wasn't typically someone's first, career. So I felt really lucky that I got involved so young, and there happened to be one of the best schools in the country was where I happened to be living, which was in San Diego, Pacific College of Oriental Medicine.
Okay.
They have 3 campuses now.
Yeah. It's so cool for me living in Asheville, seeing folks from quote unquote the alternative healing community, because like you said, when there isn't that infrastructure, you really have to live it and go make it happen for yourself and create it. And going through the med school, kind of the allopathic tradition, you just really flow with the inertia. You've got exam after exam after exam, and then you go to internship and residency, and you really just kind of fill out papers and show up for work and follow the path. And I don't know, I didn't really get into the self-discovery aspect of it and what it really meant to be a healer until much later. And so it's really interesting to hear when that spark is lit, like in the 20s, when you're young. And that's really exciting to just imagine that.
That first year of acupuncture school, I remember sitting with a friend. We were at this dance jam kind of, thing, and everybody's out there in their kind of expression, doing contact improv. We were on break after, I think it might have been after my first trimester of acupuncture school, or the first year. I can't remember, first 3 trimesters, but we were sitting there and we were just looking at each other, talking about, our past year together, and just like we had found a gold mine. I mean, like we somehow stumbled upon an absolute gold mine. We couldn't believe it, that we were both just so struck in awe of what we were getting a chance to learn. Yeah,
this healing energy, this power, because you're doing acupuncture on each other, and so you're feeling it in your body, the effects of these treatments.
Not so much that, yes, but more it's, the worldview that, this worldview that everything is connected, this one permeating energy, that mind and body aren't as separate as we've been sort of kind of trained to believe, and we can show it, this observation of nature. We can observe beauty and the impermanence of the seasons and how that lends us to be able to have a stronger sense of the changes in our own being and, holding on, letting go. It just is a wealth of information. They just like lay it on you.
Yeah.
In the first year, and you're like, whoa,
yeah.
I feel like you've gone to the moon, because never heard anybody say anything like it before, but it all was true.
Yeah.
It all felt just completely true.
It's a cohesive system.
Yeah, it's a system. A system implies cohesion, that something had something else to do with itself, which is another thing I'm really super interested in right now, is systems theory or systems biology. And
Fritjof Capra.
Exactly. We talked about that, right?
We emailed about it. Yes.
Which is, I'm so delighted that work is entering into the Western model, that, all things that we feel or imagine are separate really have a profound influence on each other, that ecology has an impact on politics, which has an impact on our economic system, which has an impact on social structures, which has an impact on healthcare systems, that we have to zoom out the lens a little bit, at least some of the time.
Yeah.
And he's so great at the way he describes that information. And this was brought to my attention by a friend of mine in Amsterdam, who's a system biologist as well as an acupuncturist, and he turned me on to these ideas and this teacher, this author.
Yeah, so real early in your journey, you get an experience of the wholeness of the Chinese medicine system. It was the Chinese medicine system?
Yeah, okay. Absolutely.
And this is a whole thing. And just as in Brooke, my partner's in Ayurveda school, that's a wholeness system and a cohesive system. And you also are a yogi, and part of the yoga world, very much a part of the yoga world. You're being honored this weekend as a teacher. So these are different backgrounds and different ways of describing the same thing, perhaps.
Yeah.
How do we jump into how you have managed to work in both of these disciplines? How do we get there?
Yeah. Well, for a long time, I've said that yoga has been the most potent healing technique or practice that I've done. Even though my professional expertise, master's degree and a doctorate in Chinese medicine, I might as well have earned those things in sort of self-directed study in yoga as well. But I'm really a physical person. I danced all the way as a young person and was a gymnast. So that's not terribly uncommon that you end up finding yoga when you have that kind of very physical nature. And
particularly as it's taught in the West with yoga classes, asana classes.
Yeah. I mean, I was naturally somewhat adept at yoga, having kind of grown up with dance. And I was also actually a diver, a competitive diver. Oh. And so all of those things sort of there's a through line there. And so
Sure.
finding my way into yoga, and Ashtanga was my first love. That's where I fell in love with yoga, and studied and practiced with Sri K. Patabi Joyce a good amount. And Tim Miller in Southern California was my yoga teacher. And
oh, wow.
Yeah.
How old were you when you started yoga?
Let's see. I was probably in my mid-20s.
Okay.
Yeah.
So shortly after you started acupuncture.
Yeah. Actually, it was a little bit later than that. I had already been practicing acupuncture, so I was probably more in my late 20s.
Yeah.
But around there, I was already practicing and just kind of found my way into Tim's yoga studio. And I always think back at how great it was that he was my teacher. I was actually referred to him. I started with a woman named Anne, who was Tim's student, who lived near me. And she said, okay, you're ready to go to Tim, kind of like that. And Tim, his logo on his sign, Ashtanga Yoga Center, is Hanuman. And I didn't know who Hanuman was, but
where is that little monkey?
Yeah, there's Hanuman. So Hanumans are always hanging around somewhere.
Yeah.
So I've, later realized how great that was. And Tim is a teacher. I would describe him of few words. Well, Ashtanga as a method is primarily counting. So, counting. And so he would count and name the asana. But his vibe was very, very devotional and really quite religious, very, again, dedicated and very devotional. And that was a really, and talk about, he's got quite a lot of prana.
Yeah.
Shakti.
Yeah. Well, so do you clearly. You were looking for Hanuman and we're just surrounded by all these beautiful objects in this office. It's a shame this is an audio recording because folks really need to be able to see this. And I guess they can see it on your website and come out here and see your studio as well. But going back to what you're saying, you started up with yoga in your 20s.
Yeah.
And you'd already been practicing acupuncture. And then, just kind of glided into this other world that combines elements of the mental and the physical and the spiritual, and it's also a cohesive world. And one of the first things I thought about before I was going to be speaking with you is I'd love to hear how you describe how you are able to integrate these disciplines in a practice, because sometimes I hear it's difficult to integrate the Chinese medicine discipline with the yoga Ayurveda discipline. But Should we talk about that?
Yeah, I'm happy to.
Okay.
I mean, honestly, it happened to me versus me trying to kind of how do these constructs, how can I nest them together? I mean, I do think about that now more as I'm, continuing to build the model and develop it more and more and more. I have to really think about things and find the way to bring the two different disciplines together. But how it began was, in sun salutations, reach up, rise up, lift up. This is connecting with yang energy of the sky. And I felt it. I mean, it spoke to me. It was like, that's what I was doing, this sort of big expansion, and then we'd sort of contract and soften in on ourselves and fold down, bowing to the earth, the mother, yin, and just back and forth. And you can see how just in and of itself, sun salutation with that breath in, breath out, one move expansion, one move is more of a contraction, is just the great or maha harmonizer. And that's just how I felt about it. I was like, that was that.
You knew it was the same thing.
It was the same thing.
Different words for the same thing.
And not only the same thing, but it was a therapy.
Right.
It wasn't, of course we know there's yoga therapy, but yoga is yoga therapy, in my opinion.
Yeah.
This whole thing about that you have to do. I mean, yes, of course you can get more. There's no shortage of things to know. You can we can know more and more and more for our whole lives, especially with these ancient technologies, any one of them, study for the rest of your life.
Yeah, right. And you'll never get it all.
You never will. So,
right.
But yoga in and of itself is a healing system. It's not just yoga therapy. And I felt that immediately. And that was the way I felt it, because I was already fairly attuned and had the education. Because even though going back to that first year or first trimester, whatever it was in acupuncture school, that was like, oh, this is a gold mine, don't get me wrong. It's vigorous, or rather rigorous and vigorous, but it's rigorous study, memorization like crazy, of just a bazillion different things of how energy moves and where it goes and how it changes and touches this, touches that, so yeah.
It's a lot of intellectual.
Yes, there's a lot of information to learn. And then, fast forward to yoga practice, that was actually when I started to really have a more personal relationship with these energies as a felt experience in my own body, how they were moving and where they were moving. And then, much later, how vibration also, when you begin to stack the different techniques like Ujjayi pranayam, this vibration breath at the throat, how that can push the energy kind of more deeply through the body. Or sometimes I like to describe it that we take the breath in, and although we know we exhale through the nose, with the exhalation, we're actually pressing the prana down the trachea. So we're pressing the energy into the loop, into the system. And you bring your awareness to that, you can really feel that, with Ujjayi pranayam, because you're contracting or kind of the trachea a little bit as you breathe in. And then the vibration, there's so much study that's been done on sound healing and how it affects the cells, and like that. So, that's just a complete no-brainer of how that can just globally affect the body.
We like to, in our modern scientific society, we like to be able to think about how we can understand it from the materialist and empirically observed scientific method, understanding cells and things like that. And at the same time, there's an energy that you can feel and you can learn how to work with that you were very much tapped into, and you could feel it across these disciplines, these different ways of accessing these energies. And can we describe for the listeners where it was that some of these sparks really took hold for you? Did you get your Chinese medicine doctorate first?
I started with a master's degree, and then I practiced for about 8 years of clinical practice. And some of my first patients were women trying to get pregnant. So I didn't set out to be a fertility doctor or a women's doctor. I just, Chinese medicine works. So I was fresh out of school, and they came in with pain in the uterus, couldn't get pregnant. Endometriosis is a diagnosis from the Western side. And I looked it up, did the points in the book, gave them the herbal medicine. And, to their credit, they were very diligent and trusted me. They both fell pregnant, these two different cases that were very extreme. So anyway, that was happening. So then they told all their friends, and then suddenly, boom, that's what I was doing, and my practice just really took off after that.
In California?
In California.
Yeah.
So I had a clinic out there for 12 years, and then I sold it and moved here about 8 years ago. And it took about 5 years where I was just trying to figure out what I wanted to do next. I knew I wanted to bring a lot of the things I was studying together, yoga and Chinese medicine, but I really was strongly into self-cultivation, which is one of the translations for Nourishing Life, which is the name of the clinic. It really means cultivating yourself. It's less about medicine and more about wellness or treating pre-illness or living a lifestyle that nourishes your life is really what I was becoming very interested in. So I didn't want to just start another clinic that was like the clinic I had in California, although I'm grateful. It was busy. I was like kind of running from room to room. I had a fantastic mentor that I got to study and work side by side with for about 12 years. And it was my first husband, Alex Taberry. And he was a great, great practitioner. And I was really lucky to be able to study with him and practice with him for a long time. But so I've kind of gotten a little bit away from your question, but that's a little bit of the background of kind of what was happening. I was the container of, then starting yoga, practice with Tim, this really strong, vigorous practice, and intimately experiencing these energies. And not only energies, but I remember, Daniel, there was a moment I was in Shavasana. This was Tim's studio. And the practice is so hard, I mean, it'll ring you out.
Yeah.
Primary series. And there was two experiences I'm thinking about, which are also energetic. But these were these kind of touch point moments that I think you were sort of wondering about.
Yeah.
One was I was in Shavasana and I just found myself weeping.
Mm-hmm.
Not a crying, and I don't know what I was weeping about.
What's the difference between weeping and crying?
I think weeping, maybe I might describe as a result of an encounter with beauty.
Okay.
Or awe, which sometimes can feel like fear. Like if you see a tidal wave from 1 foot away or,
Yeah.
in a movie,
Yeah, right.
One is, so awe is, they both belong to the water element, to the kidney. But one has a much more kind of wholesome, awe-inspiring versus like this, like dreaded fear, kind of quality.
Yeah.
But there's a through line. So I think that's just in the moment. I've never described weeping like that before, but in this moment, that's what...
Well, that's what I'm getting at. So you felt this weeping during Shavasana.
I was weeping at something like at this. I had an experience that transcended like a verbal understanding, like a kind of maybe we could describe it as like the veil kind of dropped down for a second, then went back up.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I see how things really are. And then it went back up. And then I'm left with like, what was that? I don't have any idea, but I'm weeping. Maybe that would be a way that somebody could sort of relate to.
It could be described in like the Christian tradition as a mystical experience, or it could be described as samadhi, perhaps. In the Vedic tradition. But a sense of transcending words, transcending thought, and just feeling the oneness or connection with the source, or
absorption.
Yeah.
Like there was, I think absorption, it was a moment. And I think a lot of us have experienced momentary absorption, samadhi, enlightenment moments. I think that might be a really great teaching about maybe it would be helpful to consider these states as not something that we're trying to achieve and maintain,
right?
But the teaching is truly about returning, about how can we just come back and not compare what we did yesterday or today, but like really wholesomely begin again, knowing what's possible. As a medical person, I'm always sort of putting things through that filter. And, when you have a moment like that where there isn't separation, suddenly I'm not so in opposition to my symptoms. Then healing has the opportunity to be about more than symptom resolution. It's like, okay, this is my situation. How can I become more cozy with it? And when we have a moment where it's less separate and more gelled, I think it gives us some traction towards that end.
Yeah. I'm just sitting here smiling because I really like the way you put that, where we're not in opposition to our symptoms. I haven't heard it phrased just like that before, and that really resonated with me because, then you're with it. It's a oneness. It's all together.
And I would argue that from that place, we actually have more resources to actually then heal what needs to be healed. We actually can, I don't know, sometimes I describe it using languages like there's less static, sort of that disconnecting, this huge force inside our body that wants to bring our body to homeostasis. I mean, that's like a huge imperative in our body, is wanting that.
Yeah.
And often what keeps us away from that is some way of being or thinking or doing. Like we have something to do with that static being created and getting louder or getting softer. Maybe not everything, but something to do with it.
Yeah.
And so we start to get sort of more clarity around that with these yogi practices and these Taoist practices.
That you just thinking about what you're describing here with the experience of Shavasana and really connecting with this, or having this mystical experience come over you. I'm imagining that when you had this experience, it certainly is going to pique your curiosity as to what comes next for you and what you're going to do next.
I think it more it was mainly a yes that I felt.
An affirming type feeling.
It was like, you're on to something.
Yeah.
More than, I did want to have that experience again. Don't let me, but it was more like, oh, this is real.
Yeah.
Like I'd done a lot of things in my life that I didn't know until that moment weren't real or weren't true or weren't what I needed. And at that point, I started to have some sort of barometer for the kinds of experiences, relationships, what I wanted to attract into my life was much more on this level of something very real, genuine, something that was a result of, was born from the inside, like
would you
that.
would you describe it as a spiritual awakening?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well,
Absolutely.
That's what I'm hearing in a number of these podcasts from my guests is having these affirming experiences and awakening experiences that really can light things to get them going even further. And so you had this one in Shavasana.
Had this one. Another one at Tim's studio real quick it was just a moment. And many of these are just momentary signposts, I guess.
Yeah.
Like go this way. Oh, that's something. This is something. So this weeping in Shavasana from nowhere, didn't know what it was about. Kind of the veil slips down, goes back up, but that was a yes. And okay, how can I get more of that? And
Yeah.
for sure. Another, I remember a moment in practice where, and his rooms were just always just mat to mat. I mean, there's no foot between the mats, they were literally mat to mat, sweaty. And I remember this one time that I looked at the woman practicing in front of me and just noticed how beautiful she was. And I felt like part of it, not like it was separate from me. That was another moment that I felt like, oh my God, like, what was that? I was like, whether that's a spiritual awakening, I think it's a purification. Back to that. I think it's like, they say that we practice, one way to look at it is we practice so that the prana moves up, right, towards the senses. And actually in Chinese medicine, the senses also include the openings of the heart itself, the orifices, if you could say, of the heart, as well as the 9 holes on the head. And the prana like clears the obscurations or the dust that has settled, that makes our perception of the world what it is, our conditioning and so forth. And I truly, truly believe that. And I think in that moment, my perspective was different. I mean, clearly my perspective was different. I saw this woman where typically I would feel sort of some separation, some other, some less than, sort of all of my conditioning and patterns and wounds. And suddenly I didn't come from that place. I came from a more whole Robin. I came from a more true, my own true nature, which was, these feelings of, that would be the feeling of sympathetic joy, that I got good experience from someone else's good experience. That was my first feeling, rather than it having to filter through and find that.
Yeah. Yeah, it doesn't have to be all tangled up in your ego or whatever. It's an empathic sensation and connection. And I like how you said that it's a clearing process that clears things out. What I've found in my experience with yoga that's been so affirming and inspiring is that these sensations that we feel in our body, or that I feel, it's not that it's a buzz that I'm chasing, just trying to get back to that body buzz, as it clears things out for my mind to think clearer and for me to be able to have a deeper connection with my deep values. And to clear my senses, to understand things better so that I can orient my life in a way that's with my greater purpose. And I like the word guidepost that you use. It's not necessarily that it's the sensation, that awesome sensation. That's not going to be a permanent thing in this world, but it can really guide us to how we can live a more holistically purified life, perhaps.
I think what I hear you saying is talking about alignment.
Yeah.
That not only when we, get our alignment, of the feet in a certain way and the hips in a certain way and the breath and the focus, the dristi, all of these things. I mean, that it stacks, and then we go to sort of the more pranic level of, okay, now we've got the bones and the muscles in the right shape. So now the prana can move. And then from there, then the spirit can find its rest and its clarity. And like you said, its authenticity, its purpose. So there's like a sort of this lining up of the small self with this bigger self in this connection. Like you just really feel that. You feel that connection. As I do think it's a part of what we can sometimes really limit ourselves in this conversation of alignment, as sort of this conversation of the placement of the hands or the hips. But I think it's a much bigger conversation.
So these guideposts let you know you were on the right road.
They did.
And then you mentioned, you had this career in California and you've moved back east. What brought you back this way?
I wanted a little bit of a slower pace in my life. And I can't say, well, I did have a slower pace for a while. And now I've got a fast pace again. California is a great place to learn and explore. I mean, anything you wanted to study, any teacher, any kind of subject of, almost anything. There was somebody doing it in San Diego or Los Angeles or somewhere pretty close. So just tremendous exposure to almost anything. I became a practicing Buddhist very early on before I even started yoga.
Oh.
Mainly because there was a Buddhist group meeting at my school, on Friday nights, in meditation. And I didn't really take to meditation until much later as a one of my just regular practices. But that's essentially what brought me back to the East, was just wanting to have a slower pace. California it's very, where there's so much you can learn, there's a kind of a dispersion and kind of sprawl happening there. And I was really yearning for a different kind of a more of a circling of energy, which really definitely have found here in Asheville. But what I want to tell you about were two more really important moments, if that's all right.
Yeah.
That kind of go on from those Shavasana kind of experiences, and really, I think, were some of the biggest transformational work that I had that bring together the yoga with the Chinese medicine, with healing, and just sort of really kind of braided all of these streams that were so important, so prominent in my life. And that happened, again, I was coming home from practice and I was listening to NPR. It was, before a lot of things. It was in the late 90s, and I think it was before iPods, okay? So I'm listening to the radio.
Yeah, Linda Wertheimer and Robert Siegel.
I wasn't even listening to satellite radio, like that. And I hear my first chant. I hear my first kirtan. And I didn't know anything about this kind of music before, but suddenly I'm listening to a world music hour and I hear the words, Shri Ram, Jai Ram, Jai Jai Ram. And this was by Krishnadas.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know him. I didn't know the words, but I just know that I had another moment where I'm hearing these sounds and I was just like, what is this? There was something inside my brain that switched a gear, or something. And I just tuned into it. And that was at a time where you had to drive to the music store to buy a CD, know. And I did, and I went and bought the CD, and I could not listen to this music. It was in my car, it was in my house, it was in my clinic. And I listened to this for a year straight, and then started to see Krishna Das when he would come to town. And then I would go to LA and see Krishna Das, and I would go to retreat and be with Krishna Das. So I became very much interested in chanting. And, as Krishna Das would explain it, I mean, I'm probably butchering it, but what I kind of took from the chanting is that the words call to our own true nature, that they reflect and are our own true nature, so that when we hear these sounds, that we resonate with them. When we resonate with them, we're resonating with something true that we're recognizing that's already in us, and it's bringing that forth. And that's how we understand these names aren't really a referral language, but they are the essence of the energy itself. That's sort of my understanding, and maybe why I had such a prominent experience with chanting. So
it's the vibration.
There's the vibration for sure. It's like a kind of vibrating these sounds of my own true name inside my own being. Yeah. And as another kind of level of purification, I think arguably, to the chi and the life force and how that all works, and the prana. And very soon after being with Krishna Das, I learned about Ram Das, who showed Krishna Das about chanting and, kind of turned him on to his path. And so I didn't know really Ram Das much, except I'd studied him a little bit in Chinese medicine school. And just also, let me just kind of parallel say, this is around the time I was going back to get my doctorate. So I was in Chinese medicine school after 8 years, and it was an integrative training. So, everything we were doing, we had to show from the Chinese medicine side and from the Western medicine side. So we had to kind of prove everything and defend everything and analyze everything. So kind of get into this sort of macro view and this more reductionist view. And, in my time I wasn't in training, I was reading about Ram Dass and going to be on retreat with Ram Dass. And, one of his central messages has been, encouraging this notion of being versus doing. Certainly in his book, Be Here Now. Like that. And his book about aging, Still Here, which is quite nice. And one of his most recent books is Be Love Now. So that's his arc from Be Here Now to Be Love Now. But very specifically, and I hope this is all right, but, it really had a dramatic effect on the clinical setting, the dichotomy of being with Ram Dass and being in the doctoral program, and then I'm here working with patients in my clinic. And what I was learning from him was about how to be, and how this opposition to our challenges, to our suffering, to our pain, to our symptoms, that maybe they can be a bridge to something deeper. Maybe they can be a bridge to something that's important to be seen, that needs to be uncovered, that wishes to be uncovered in your life. I mean, there was a film made about Ram Dass called Fierce Grace.
Yeah, I've seen that.
And it's about his stroke. Yeah, about his stroke, and about how he came to make friends with it, essentially. Or how do we make friends with our great suffering in life and not be buried under it or victimized by it. And that had a huge impact on my clinical approach with patients. It became much more common for patients to start to cry in their sessions. And it's not like I wanted to go in there and do something to them, but it was much more about, I found myself sitting and being with people, trying to find resonance, helping them to, gently turn towards and soften to,
Yeah.
the whole range of possibilities. So often people come in and they have a certain outcome they're looking for, that things can go one way. That means symptoms gone,
Yeah, right.
So it's a very narrow, tight expression,
Yeah.
so I found
That's our goal when we go to the doctor. As long as I can get rid of this symptom, mission accomplished, on to lunch or whatever.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so it became about what you're experiencing possibly isn't separate from the rest of your life, but an expression of, maybe that can be part of the conversation. That's a conversation I have here a lot, that, our challenges aren't outside of our life, they're inside our life. So let's look at our life.
And you being able to grow and grow with your empathy and your compassionate nature, it sounds like, from this work that you were doing, cultivating it. I'm hearing that was really fueling your practice, and it was growing and deepening.
Well, it's funny. I was just reading a passage from a book, 2,500-year-old book, yesterday. I mean, the book's not that old. The writing is that old. But they're talking about sort of this.
What book was it?
The Web That Has No Weaver by Ted Kapchuk. Okay. Chapter 9.
Okay.
Penetrating Divine Illumination. And this is the highest form of healing. And it reminded me of this story because, and again, I'm probably going to butcher this, but they talk about the first level of healing is where you are putting a patient's, as a physician, you're putting a patient's condition into context. So, you treat a cough, not just as cough, but what kind of cough, what kind of person, what kind of fitness level, how long they've had, all these different, what's the context? Is it hot cough or cold cough or phlegm cough or dry cough, or what season is it, and better and worse, all these different sort of things. So you put it into context. Yeah. And then the second level, which is a little bit harder to achieve, is that the part is never separate from the whole. So this sort of holistic view, and that you can really assess a patient from any part. So you don't even need to experience the cough to be able to give them the proper treatment. You can look at their tongue or feel their pulse or hear their life story or just experience them if you're very sensitive.
Okay.
So the part is, this is a holistic model. So that's part of why we can read the pulse and look at the tongue and feel the meridians and make a diagnosis, and some people don't listen to anything. They just do those things, which is sort of interesting. That's not my way, but I'm much more of a communicator. And then this third way is this one I was talking about, this penetrating divine illumination, which is where you, as the physician, as with your body language and the tenor of your voice and your motivation, your intention, your compassion, your own, really what we're talking about is your own cultivation, your own self-development is what really informs this level of healing that emerging happens with the patient, that a resonance of what we would call chi happens, where the assessment becomes the intervention, that the chi changes as a result of that moment of connection, like the depth of experience where, soul meets soul and spirit is reflecting spirit. And that's when the person would usually cry, because they saw something perhaps in themselves, like a grasping. This was usually around wanting to have a child. Mm-hmm. Like, oh, I'll be happy when. And sometimes I would, when I have the child and when I have the take home baby, like that. And I would say, well, like, what will you be if the baby doesn't come? Who are you if you're not a mother? That's another friend of mine, likes to do this sort of level of self-inquiry to create more space. And that's something she asks that I've liked. But those kinds of things of really trying to reflect something deeper. I mean, not even trying. This is what's happening as a result of studying with Ram Dass. These kinds of experiences were emerging all on their own. In the treatment rooms, patient would cry, and I'm like, why are all these patients crying? Mm-hmm. It was just very interesting because at the very same time I was doing the doctoral program and having to like prove everything I was doing. And all I actually wanted to do was I wanted to go back into those treatment rooms and have these experiences with people that I couldn't put words to, that I couldn't understand.
Yeah.
That they would just soften, and like there is more than one way that this could turn out. And I would arguably say that was a healing movement. Almost to the beginning of our talk, that I think then frees them up actually to have more access to the very energies that are going to be helpful in their healing. So it's this very interesting loop that the more you try sometimes to do something, the further it moves away from you. And that, I don't know if you're relating to what I'm...
Well, as I'm hearing this, it sounds like it's not like the healer is creating the process. It's that the healer is surrendering to the empathy and the healing process that's just there, and the total process. And then the healer and the patient together are experiencing the suffering and also the opportunity, and something happens from that whole process, perhaps. That's what it sounds like to me.
Yeah, there's a recognition combined with a willingness and a holding of that space. It's not anything that I could teach someone to do. I think it's a product of us as practitioners cultivating ourselves.
Yes.
That it happens all on its own.
Yeah.
And that's what this book would call this highest form of healing.
So, as you were talking about your work, your specialty is women's health.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yeah, it is.
Okay. And you practice out of this Nourishing Life Center where we're at right now. And you've described some of the qualities. I'm just getting this sense of the empathy you bring and the compassion you bring to your work. But who are your typical clients? Who are the folks who come to the Nourishing Life Center, and who are you reaching out to?
Yeah. I treat women really throughout the whole life cycle.
Mm-hmm. So
I have young women come who are trying to conceive, others who are desperately trying not to conceive and don't know what kind of birth control to use. So that's when I get to kind of share about, different birth control methods and teach a little bit about fertility, not only as a narrow reproductive marker, but as a state of being. Fertility is life, is movement. And I try to share with younger women, especially, to keep their fertility strong rather than suppress it with hormonal drugs. But, that's not for everyone. And there's a time and a place and a limit and so forth for that. It's not a good lifetime solution to birth control. But, so keeping the body, flowing.
And
vital and circulating, the ovaries alive. So I work with that. And then, the whole range of menstrual disorders or, even other issues that affect feminine culture, like, overwork and underrest and overstressed and not enough time and just kind of being everything to everyone. Meanwhile, I have a self-esteem problem and a, a body image problem, and I have PMS, and I'm depressed, and I'm just trying to get ahead. I mean, all this stuff, so all of this finds its way into this room and these rooms. I treat pregnant women, and one of my patients sent me a beautiful 3D ultrasound picture of her baby. That's just absolutely amazing. She's 27 weeks, and we can perfectly see her face in this 3D ultrasound. It's unbelievable.
Wow.
And so I'm helping this patient, feel good during her pregnancy. And I treat a lot of women in perimenopause, because that, is something that can be extremely well controlled and managed, especially if we begin to work on it earlier, like in late 30s, early 40s.
Oh, okay.
So many women, I hope you don't mind if I give a little shout out, public service announcement, but so many women are surprised to hear that they reach their fertile peak at age 28. And it can be 28 to 35. It's sort of like a plateau. But really, we think 28. And I think when more and more women are realizing that and having families earlier, I think seeing all the women in my generation have to, do all this procedural, medicine to try to have a baby instead of just, making love in bed. Imagine such a thing, getting pregnant like that. A lot of people don't even think to do it like that anymore. They schedule it. A lot of people, I guess I see a lot of them anyway.
Yeah.
So, but from age 28 to 35, depending on your degree of how I describe moving through your resources, like how much energy you're spending versus how much energy you're absorbing through happiness and feeling love and eating nutrient-dense food and getting acupuncture, practicing yoga, chanting, just, getting filled up.
Yeah.
A lot of people are getting drained every day. And then they're surprised that, their fertility is diminished when it sort of becomes time, to have a baby after they've gotten everything kind of lined up on the outside. I'm very interested in that. Actually just continues right into the menopause conversation, because were you to continue to use resources, then you're even that much more depleted as your body is kind of recalibrating into menopause, and you don't have the resiliency that's required to make that transition more smoothly, like just as a walk through menopause. So really my work started in fertility, and I have a DVD that is kind of where so much of this began. In 2010 was making that DVD for fertility enhancement and women's health, which takes you through the menstrual cycle and 4 different yoga practices that mirror the hormonal fluctuations throughout the menstrual cycle, which...
And you have a yoga studio here. Yeah,
I have yoga, and I teach this system called Tao Flow Yoga here.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and I'm just... So that work that started in fertility enhancement has really kind of found its way all the way through perimenopause. Once I started teaching day in, day out... its application grew. And so that's pretty much what I do here, is work, with all of these issues. But that real centerpiece of self-awareness, really living with your eyes wide open, accountability, authenticity. Knowing the price tag of what we're doing and going for it one way or the other.
Yeah, being aware of what's going on.
What I'm doing.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Saraswati, at the beginning of this, I said I'd interrupt more, but I just found myself listening because you're such a teacher. I know. I failed you.
I'm like, please stop it.
It's hard to interrupt when there's such interesting conversation being had and such good teaching going on. And you're going to be recognized this weekend. Just happens to be the weekend of the Asheville Yoga Fest.
Yes.
And you're going to be teaching and being recognized. Is that right?
Well, why am I so shy about it? I need to own it. I'm talking about ownership, and I'm like,
well, what a great honor. That
Yeah. I'm teaching a class tomorrow. This will give you a little kind of idea on the sorts of things I like to talk about. But the class is titled Ancestral Wisdom, the Ovaries and the Hips. No mud, no lotus. So, So really about the second chakra and which house the ovaries, house the DNA, which came from our ancestors that live within us, that we have this sort of propensity to become what they were. Or there's this idea in Chinese medicine that we can tonify our ancestors, meaning we can stop it in its tracks. We see it, we recognize it, we take it for the good, and we also have the ability to take a right turn towards something different. And the mud is necessary. That's the mud. And from that, the lotus in our own hearts flowers open all on its own.
Wow. Well, that is the essence of the podcast, is connecting these healing stories and learning how we can participate in our own health. And so thank you so much for sharing what you did today. This was wonderful. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much. I think it's you. It's your energy, and
it's this great space we got here. It's really great.
It's all three of us. I mean,
Brooke's been here all along, observing and listening quietly.
Well, smiling and nodding and just really, I really appreciate just what you're doing and what you're bringing. And thank you so much for having me as a guest.
You are welcome.
It's really been an honor.
And thank you. How do you feel?
I feel good. How do you feel?
I feel good. I feel inspired.
Yeah, likewise.
Yeah, great. Well, have a great Yoga Fest this weekend and enjoy it. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel.
All right.
Bye.
Well, that was it. My conversation with Dr. Saraswati. What a treat that was to get a chance to meet her and speak with her. She was so gracious to have me and Brooke out to her Nourishing Life Center, which is just a beautiful space in Woodfin. Wonderful women's health center. So thanks again to her, and thanks to you for tuning in to Anecdotal Evidence. It's your host, Daniel Johnson, MD. Make sure to check us out on YouTube. And our home on the web is danieljohnsonmd.com/podcast. It's on iTunes and in other locations. So please keep checking us out and send us any feedback to anecdotalevidence@danieljohnsonmd.com. So until next time, signing off. Take care.